The encounter that changed everything. Mia Carter adjusted her rearview mirror as she pulled into a nearly deserted gas station. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The station looked like a relic from another time. Dusty, faded signage, and a single convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights. She had driven for hours, the monotony of the open road pressing against her, but she wasn't just any traveler passing through. She was a highly trained agent of the United States Secret Service, and today she was on a mission. Her black jacket concealed more than just her form. It held her credentials, her badge, and the weapon at her side. Though she was trained to blend in, Mia always carried herself with a quiet confidence, an unspoken authority that only those who understood power could recognize. She stepped out of the vehicle, her boots pressing lightly against the cracked concrete, and grabbed the gas pump. As the fuel flowed, her keen eyes scanned the surroundings out of pure instinct. A lone sedan sat parked near the convenience store, its driver hunched over his phone. A mother hurriedly strapped her child into the backseat of an old SUV, her movements quick and tired. It was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place where people passed through without much thought. Mia had just started toward the store when she noticed it. A patrol car pulling into the lot, its engine humming low. She didn't react, but she felt the weight of the officer's gaze land on her like a stone. He didn't get out at first. He watched. Her training told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a routine patrol. Then the door creaked open, and a man stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished. He adjusted his belt, his hand grazing the baton at his side. The nameplate on his chest read Officer B. Harris. Mia kept walking, pretending she didn't notice the way he studied her. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying a tone of authority that was just a little too sharp. She turned slightly, her expression neutral. "Yes, officer." He took a step closer. "I need to ask you a few questions." Mia stopped, keeping her posture relaxed but ready. "Is there a problem?" His mirrored sunglasses concealed his eyes, but she didn't need to see them to know what he was thinking. "This isn't a busy area," he said. "Are you from around here?" Mia glanced at the empty road, the near-deserted station. It was a harmless question on the surface, but the way he asked it made it clear. It wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. "No," she said evenly. "Just passing through." He took another step forward. "Where you headed?" Mia felt her patience wearing thin, but she had dealt with men like this before. "That's personal." Brad's lips tightened. "You being evasive for a reason." Mia exhaled slowly, keeping her tone controlled. "Officer, I stopped for gas and a drink. That's all." His hand rested on his belt now. "I need to see some ID." There it was. The shift. Mia knew her rights. She had done nothing wrong. Yet here she was, being scrutinized for the simple act of existing in a place where, in his mind, she didn't belong. She moved slowly, deliberately reaching for her wallet. She could feel the tension in the air, feel the small audience of bystanders who had begun to take notice. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it over. Brad studied it, his eyes flicking back up to her. "What brings you out here, Miss Carter?" "I told you," she said. "Passing through." "What kind of work?" He pressed. Mia met his gaze. "I'm afraid that's classified." Something in his face hardened. "Classified?" He let out a dry chuckle. "That's a little suspicious, don't you think?" Mia remained silent. Brad took another step, invading her personal space. "Look, I don't like your attitude." Mia's patience finally ran out. "With all due respect, officer, I have complied with your requests. If there's a legitimate issue, I'd appreciate you clarifying it." Brad's jaw clenched. "I think you're hiding something." She could see it then, the moment he made the decision. "I'm calling for backup," he said abruptly, stepping back and speaking into his radio. Mia knew where this was going. It wasn't about the law. It was about control. Minutes later, another patrol car arrived, and a second officer stepped out, younger, uncertain. He exchanged a brief conversation with Brad, then turned to Mia, his expression unsure. "Miss Carter," Brad said, "we're going to need to search your vehicle." Mia's gaze sharpened. On what grounds? Suspicious behavior. She exhaled, keeping her voice steady. "I'm afraid I can't allow that. Unless you have a warrant, you have no right to search my vehicle." Brad's face darkened. "We'll see about that." His hand moved toward his taser. Mia felt her muscles tense. Her training screamed at her to de-escalate, to maintain control. But she knew that for men like him, there was no winning. "Officer," she said, raising her hand slightly in a non-threatening gesture, "I am not resisting." But he had already made up his mind. The taser's crackling filled the air. Pain erupted through her body as the electrical surge overtook her muscles. Her vision blurred, her limbs locked. She hit the ground hard, her breath knocked from her lungs. A gasp rippled through the small crowd of bystanders. A man near the store had his phone raised, recording. "What the hell?" someone shouted. Mia's entire body convulsed as the voltage coursed through her. She tried to focus, to breathe. Through the haze of pain, she saw something slip from her jacket pocket, a small metallic badge, glinting in the sunlight. It tumbled to the pavement, landing just inches from Brad's boot. The letters engraved on it were clear. United States Secret Service. For the first time, Brad hesitated. His smug arrogance flickered with something else, uncertainty. The rookie officer's face drained of color. "Brad, I think we messed up." Before Brad could react, the sound of approaching engines roared through the air. Mia turned her head, her muscles still recovering from the taser's assault. 3 black SUVs sped into the lot, their tinted windows hiding the figures inside. The doors burst open simultaneously, and a group of men and women in dark suits and earpieces poured out, their movements precise and rehearsed. The lead agent, a tall black man with a steely gaze, strode toward them. He took one look at Mia, her body still trembling from the taser, then turned his hard stare on Brad. "Step away from her." Now, Brad, for the first time, looked genuinely afraid. Mia exhaled shakily. Justice had arrived. And Brad Harris had no idea what was about to hit him. The consequences of power. Brad Harris stood frozen, his fingers still gripping the taser handle as the weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a tidal wave. His mind scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. The woman he had just tased, the woman he had belittled, suspected, and escalated a situation against, wasn't just some random traveler. She was Secret Service. His heart pounded. The badge lay gleaming on the cracked pavement, the words United States Secret Service practically burning into his retinas. The rookie officer beside him, Eric Daniels, shifted uncomfortably, his youthful features twisted with regret and panic. "Brad, we..." Eric started, his voice cracking, but before he could finish, the black SUV skidded to a stop with a force that sent tiny waves of dust across the lot. The gas station, which had been a small pocket of silence just minutes ago, was now buzzing with an undeniable tension. The moment the vehicle stopped, their doors flew open with military precision. Men and women in sleek black suits stepped out in swift, controlled movements. Dark sunglasses, earpieces, and a commanding presence. These were not ordinary law enforcement officers. These were some of the most highly trained agents in the world, and they had just watched one of their own get assaulted. The lead agent, a towering man with deep brown skin and sharp, observant eyes, stormed forward with an authority that made even the air around him feel heavier. His gaze snapped to Mia Carter, still lying on the pavement, recovering from the electric shock that had coursed through her body just seconds before. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice like a steel blade cutting through the tension. He knelt beside her, scanning her face with a mixture of concern and fury. "Are you all right?" Mia, through sheer force of will, pushed herself up to a seated position. The aftershocks of the taser still made her muscles twitch, but her expression remained composed. Her gaze flickered from Brad to the Secret Service agent. "I'm fine, Brooks," she managed, her voice strained but firm. Agent Damon Brooks. Brad had heard that name before. Special Agent Damon Brooks was a high-ranking member of the Secret Service counterterrorism unit. He was known for being relentless, calculated, and merciless when it came to matters of national security. And now he was standing just feet away from Brad, eyes burning with barely contained rage. Brooks stood slowly, his full height towering over Brad in an imposing way that made the officer's throat dry up. "Step away from her," Brooks commanded. Brad's pulse skyrocketed. His hand hovered near his belt, the instinct to reach for his gun flickering in his mind. But something deep inside him screamed don't. He wasn't dealing with a drunk civilian or a petty criminal. He was standing in front of federal agents, highly trained, heavily armed federal agents. Brad raised his hand slightly, stepping back just as Brooks took a single, deliberate step forward. "What the hell do you think you were doing?" Brooks demanded, his voice dangerously low. Brad swallowed hard. I thought she was." "You thought?" Brooks cut him off, his voice sharp. "What exactly did you think, Officer Harris? That a black woman at a gas station was automatically suspicious? That she was some kind of criminal because she wouldn't let you trample over her rights?" Brad flinched, but before he could respond, another agent moved forward, retrieving Mia's fallen badge from the pavement. He dusted it off and handed it back to her with a respectful nod. Mia slowly rose to her feet, her body still aching, but her resolve unshaken. She took her badge and clipped it back onto her belt, making sure Brad saw it, making sure he understood. Brad's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. He had done nothing wrong. At least, that's what he had told himself just minutes ago. Now, as he stood face to face with federal agents who knew the law better than he ever would, he realized just how badly he had screwed up. Brooks crossed his arms, eyes still locked onto him. "Give me your badge and your weapon, Officer Harris." Brad's stomach twisted into knots. "Do you what?" "You assaulted a federal agent without just cause," Brooks continued, his voice growing colder. "You escalated a situation based on nothing more than your own bias and paranoia. You're lucky she isn't pressing criminal charges, but make no mistake, your actions will not go unpunished." Brad's breathing grew erratic. This was spiraling out of control too fast. He turned to Eric, looking for support, but his younger partner only looked away, his jaw tight with silent shame. "Hand it over," Brooks repeated. Brad hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent years climbing the ranks of the force, building his reputation, asserting his authority. And now, in just 7 minutes, all of it was being ripped from him. His fingers hovered over his belt. "No," Brooks barked. The command struck him like a hammer to the chest. With a shaking hand, Brad unclipped his badge and gun, handing them both over. The weight of them, leaving his hands, felt like a death sentence. Brooks took them, inspected them, then turned to one of the agents. "Take his weapon and log it as evidence." Brad's lips parted, his throat suddenly too dry to form words. Evidence. His gun was going into evidence. His stomach twisted painfully as reality set in. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was the end of his career. Mia, still standing strong despite the pain, finally spoke. Her voice wasn't filled with anger. It was worse. It was steady, unwavering. "I gave you every chance," she said, her eyes locked onto him. "Every opportunity to de-escalate. I complied. I followed the law. And yet, you still saw me as a threat." Brad opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but Mia didn't let him. "You saw my skin before you saw my credentials," she continued. "You saw what you wanted to see, and now you have to live with the consequences." Brad clenched his fists, his entire body trembling. Consequences. That word rang in his ears like a siren. For years, he had been the one in control, the one giving orders, the one making people afraid of consequences. And now he was on the other side. Eric shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with what was happening. He turned to Mia, his voice softer. "Agent Carter, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know how to stop it." Mia studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "It's not easy to challenge authority," she said, "but it's necessary." Eric swallowed, shame tightening his features. He had learned something today. Something real. Brad, on the other hand, felt his entire identity cracking. Then the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tense silence. Local police. The gas station, once again, became the center of something much larger than itself. And Brad Harris, for the first time in his career, understood what real fear felt like. Because this time, he wasn't the one holding the power. The reckoning begins. The gas station, once a quiet, unremarkable stop along the highway, had transformed into the epicenter of something far larger than Officer Brad Harris had ever imagined. The distant wail of approaching sirens filled the air, a stark reminder that he was no longer the one calling the shots. Instead, he stood frozen, stripped of his weapon and badge, surrounded by federal agents whose authority far exceeded his own. Mia Carter remained standing, her posture unwavering despite the lingering pain from the taser's electric shock. She had seen men like Brad before, officers who wielded authority like a hammer, crushing anyone they deemed unworthy. But now, for the first time, Brad Harris was on the receiving end of accountability, and he didn't know how to handle it. Agent Damon Brooks remained by Mia's side, his sharp eyes never leaving Brad. His presence alone was an unspoken promise of justice. Unlike Brad, Brooks understood the true weight of power, when to use it and when to restrain it. One of the Secret Service agents, a woman with cropped brown hair and an earpiece still pressed to her ear, stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable, but the look she gave Brad wasn't one of sympathy. "Local police are 2 minutes out," she informed Brooks. "We've already flagged Harris's actions through our federal system. There will be an immediate review." Brad's stomach turned at her words. Immediate review. He had been on the force long enough to know what that meant. His career was finished. The crackle of radios and murmurs of the gathered onlookers added to the tension. More people had arrived, some drawn by the cluster of black SUVs, others by the growing whispers of injustice. A few still had their phones up, recording every second. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was a national scandal in the making. And Brad Harris, he was the face of it. The chaos of True Fifth. The first local patrol car skidded into the lot. 2 officers stepped out, one older, grizzled, and visibly irritated, the other younger but composed. They took in the scene, the Secret Service agents, and the restrained intruders who had tried to ambush the gas station. But their eyes landed on Brad Harris last, and the moment they saw him standing there, disarmed, stripped of his badge, their confusion was clear. Officer Harris, the senior officer, Lieutenant Paul Simmons, spoke, his brow furrowed as he approached. "What the hell is going on here?" Before Brad could stammer out an answer, Brooks stepped forward. "Your officer just tased a federal agent without cause," Brooks said coldly, his words laced with authority. "And now he's being held accountable." A ripple of shock passed between the local officers. "Wait, what?" Simmons' eyes darted toward Mia, who stood silent but strong. Mia pulled back her jacket slightly, revealing her badge. "United States Secret Service," she confirmed. "Your officer saw fit to ignore my rights, escalated an unnecessary situation, and used force without justification." Simmons paled. The other officer, young and visibly rattled, took a small step back as if suddenly realizing that this wasn't just an internal matter. This was federal. I didn't know," Brad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia's gaze hardened. You didn't care to know. The weight of her words struck deep. Simmons let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He had seen Harris be overzealous before, but this was something else entirely. Is he being detained? Simmons asked Brooks, his tone carefully neutral. Brooks shook his head. Not yet. But trust me, he will answer for this. The federal government doesn't take kindly to agents being assaulted by local law enforcement. Brad flinched at the word assaulted, because that's exactly what it was. No badge, no uniform, no excuses could change that. He had assaulted a federal agent. The gas station crowd murmured louder now, whispers turning into outrage. Some people took a step forward, no longer afraid to challenge the power dynamic they had always assumed was unbreakable. A middle-aged black woman near the convenience store's entrance scoffed loudly. Y'all see what happens when the roles are reversed, she muttered, shaking her head. Ain't so fun when it's you being treated like a criminal, huh? Brad felt those words like a punch to the gut, because she was right. The cost of power abused. As the situation escalated, Eric Daniels, Brad's rookie partner, finally found his voice. He turned to Simmons, his face pale but determined. Sir, he said, shifting uncomfortably. I need to be honest. Simmons turned to him sharply. Now's the time, Daniels. Eric took a deep breath. I knew what we were doing was wrong, he admitted. I knew it wasn't suspicious for someone to just stop for gas. But I didn't say anything. He swallowed. And that makes me part of the problem. The moment those words left his lips, Brad felt something shatter inside him. His own partner, the one who had looked up to him, trusted him, was now turning away from his example. Mia watched Eric carefully. She wasn't sure if she respected him yet. He had let it happen. He had stood by and done nothing when it mattered. But now he was owning it, which was more than Brad could say. Simmons exhaled sharply, his frustration clear. Officer Harris, based on what I'm hearing, you're going on administrative leave effective immediately. Pending further investigation, your future on this force is. Don't bother, Brooks interrupted, his voice cold as ice. His career's already over. The words hit harder than Brad expected. His jaw tightened, his pulse hammered, his ego screamed. But deep down, he knew they were true. The FINALVERDICT. The sun had started setting, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement of the gas station. The flashing lights of patrol cars and federal SUVs reflected off the glass windows of the store. The day had started with Brad Harris in control. Now he was just another name about to be wiped from the system. Simmons turned to Mia, his face lined with exhaustion. Agent Carter, I give you my word, this will be handled the right way. Mia nodded, though she wasn't naive enough to believe words alone. I'll be following up, she said simply. Simmons gave a tight nod. He knew she would. Brad stood, his limbs heavy, his mouth dry, his mind blank. He had spent years telling himself he was a good cop, and yet the truth had caught up to him in just 7 minutes. Now, all that was left was the reckoning, and for the first time in his life, there was no badge to protect him. The weight of judgment. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the gas station lot, as Officer Brad Harris stood in stunned silence. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of finality. Just minutes ago, he had been the authority, the one in control, the one who could demand obedience and expect compliance. Now, stripped of his badge, his weapon, and the illusion of power, he felt exposed, vulnerable. The man who had wielded the law as a hammer now stood before those who would judge him for it. And the worst part, he had no defense. The weight of the stairs burned into his skin. Mia Carter, her gaze steady and unforgiving. Agent Damon Brooks, unyielding, waiting for the consequences to fall. His own partner, Eric Daniels, who had once looked to him for guidance, now standing against him, and the growing crowd. They had no sympathy, because they had seen this before. But this time, the script had flipped. The badge didn't shield him. The NEWS brakes. A sharp voice cut through the thick air. "Agent Carter, one question, please." Brad flinched, startled. He hadn't even noticed when the first news van arrived, its logo gleaming under the fading sunlight. A female reporter, holding a microphone, rushed forward as her cameraman trailed behind her. The entire gas station confrontation had gone viral in real time. News outlets had caught wind of the footage being circulated online, and now the first wave of journalists had arrived, eager to capture a scandal. "Agent Carter," the reporter pressed, her eyes gleaming with urgency, "do you believe this was a racially motivated incident?" Brad's breath hitched. He wanted to scream that it wasn't, that he had only been doing his job, that he would have treated anyone the same way. But he couldn't, because even he knew that was a lie. Mia Carter didn't hesitate. She turned toward the reporter, her voice even. "This was about bias," she said. "This was about an abuse of power. And if I didn't have this..." She pulled back her jacket, revealing her Secret Service badge once again. "I would have been just another statistic." The crowd murmured in agreement. "But Agent Carter," the reporter continued, pushing further, "this officer will likely face consequences. Is that enough? Or do you believe this is part of a larger problem in law enforcement?" Brad felt his pulse pound. Mia studied the reporter for a moment before responding. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to act on their biases without facing consequences, until now." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes furiously. Brad clenched his fists at his sides, his shame boiling over. Until now. Until he had become the example. The internal AFFARS decision. Another patrol car arrived. This one was different, unmarked. Black-tinted windows. Brad's gut sank. He knew exactly who it was. Internal Affairs. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Captain Jonathan Reyes, head of the department's Internal Affairs Division. A man who had spent years investigating dirty cops. Reyes was well known, feared. His presence at the scene meant one thing. The department had already made its decision. "Officer Harris," Reyes called, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. Brad's stomach twisted. He took a breath, forcing himself to step forward. The entire gas station was silent now. No officers came to his aid. No fellow cops defended him. For the first time in his life, he stood alone. Effective immediately, Rice continued, "You are suspended without pay pending a full disciplinary hearing. Based on preliminary evidence and federal involvement, the likelihood of formal termination is high." Brad felt the words like a hammer to his ribs. Suspended. Terminated. He had always believed that only bad cops lost their jobs. And yet, here he was. Rice handed him a slip of paper. "You'll receive official notice of the hearing date. Turn in any department-issued property before the end of the week." Brad's hands trembled as he took the paper. "You should also be aware," Rice continued, "that the DOJ has been notified. A civil rights investigation may be underway soon." Brad nearly choked on his breath. A federal investigation. This wasn't just about his job. This was about his future, his entire life. If the Department of Justice got involved, he could be blacklisted from law enforcement entirely. The community is FONDs. The tension in the air was thick. The people who had gathered around the gas station weren't just watching. They were waiting. Waiting to see what would happen next. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice rang out. About damn time. It was a middle-aged black man standing near the edge of the lot, arms crossed. His tone wasn't triumphant. It was tired, like he had seen this story too many times before. Another voice. "You finally know what it feels like, huh?" Brad couldn't take it anymore. He turned toward the growing crowd, his shame curdling into anger. "You don't know me," he snapped. "I'm not." "You're not what?" A woman near the front interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "Not racist. Not part of the problem. How many other people have you done this to that didn't have a badge to save them?" Brad opened his mouth, then shut it, because he had no answer. How many people had he pulled over for looking suspicious? How many times had he let his gut feelings dictate who he saw as a threat? How many times had he been wrong? He would never know the full number. But they did. Every black man who had been forced to step out of their car for no reason. Every woman who had been asked if the vehicle she was driving was really hers. Every innocent person who had to justify their existence in places where they were deemed out of place. They all knew. And now Brad felt it. And it crushed him. Mia Carter's final words. Mia Carter, who had been silent as this all unfolded, finally stepped forward. She met Brad's eyes, not with rage, not with vengeance, with truth. "You always thought you had power," she said, her voice level. "But power isn't about what's on your badge. It's about the choices you make." Brad didn't speak, because there was nothing to say. Mia turned toward Brooks, nodding. "We're done here." Brooks gave a final glance toward Brad, then signaled for the Secret Service agents to move out. The black SUVs started up, their engines low and steady, as the agents climbed inside. And just like that, the real authority left, leaving Brad standing there, alone, stripped of his badge, stripped of his illusion of control, and for the first time in his life, truly powerless. The fall of Officer Brad Harris. The engines of the black SUVs rumbled low as they began to pull away from the gas station. The Secret Service agents had done their job, secured their package, protected their own, and held a reckless officer accountable. Now, their mission took them elsewhere. But for Officer Brad Harris, this was the beginning of his end. The moment the last black SUV disappeared into the highway's horizon, reality slammed into him like a fist to the gut. The crowd remained, their eyes locked onto him. The people who had once feared his badge, his uniform, his authority, now looked at him like he was nothing. And maybe he was. His badge was gone, his weapon confiscated, his power erased. The whispers from the gathered onlookers grew louder, turning into something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Humiliation, disgust, vindication. They weren't just here to witness his fall. They were relishing it. The moment everything. Chi Eric Daniels, his younger partner, shifted beside him, clearly uncomfortable. "Brad," he started, but his voice died out. He had no words, because what could he say? "Sorry you got caught. Sorry you ruined your own career." Eric had been silent when it mattered, but now he saw. And that realization stung. Lieutenant Paul Simmons, Brad's superior, wasn't looking at him like a boss disappointed in his officer. He was looking at Brad like he had already been discarded, like he wasn't even a cop anymore. Simmons took a deep breath, rubbing his forehead. "You need to go home, Harris," he said, "before this gets worse." But Brad knew there was no going home. Because home wasn't just a place. Home was the identity he had built for himself. And now, that identity had collapsed. The social media fiery storm. His phone buzzed. Then again. It had been vibrating nonstop, but he had been too frozen to check it. Finally, with shaking hands, he pulled it out and saw the notifications flooding in. His name, his face, all over social media. Coptase's black Secret Service agent now faces justice. Brad Harris, another racist officer exposed. He thought she was just another black woman. He was wrong. There was video footage. The entire world had seen him pull that taser, had seen him abuse his authority, had seen him lose everything in a matter of minutes. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. His wife would see this. His kids, his parents, His friends, if he even had any left, they were all watching his downfall in real time. He had become the monster, and there was no running from it. The final blow. Brad was still standing in shock when another car pulled into the lot. A familiar one. His chief. Chief David Monroe. The man who had defended him too many times before. The man who had looked the other way when he had stopped people under suspicious circumstances. The man who had never asked too many questions when Brad had filed his reports. But today, that man wasn't here to save him. Monroe stepped out, his posture stiff, his face carved from stone. For a brief, stupid moment, Brad felt hope. Maybe Monroe would say something. Maybe he would fix this. Maybe this wasn't over. Then Monroe spoke. "You're done, Brad." And just like that, the last piece of his world shattered. Done. Not suspended. Not under review. Done. The word hit like a bullet to the skull. Brad stumbled. He actually stumbled. Monroe crossed his arms. "You think I can protect you after this? The whole damn country's watching." His voice was hard, unapologetic. And Brad, for the first time in his entire life, he felt small. The walk of shame. The crowd had grown. People were still filming, still watching, still waiting for him to fall apart. And the worst part, they didn't fear him anymore. No one called him Officer Harris. No one respected him. No one even looked at him like he was human. They saw him for what he truly was. A coward. A fraud. A man who had been stripped of everything that had once made him feel powerful. Simmons nodded toward his patrol car. "Leave your keys. Someone else will take it back to the station." Brad hesitated, then pulled them from his pocket. The jingling of the keys as they left his hand felt final, like the slamming of a prison cell door. He turned, taking his first steps away from the station, away from his career, away from his identity. And the crowd. They watched every step. He could feel their eyes drilling into his back. Their disgust. Their judgment. For years, he had made others feel powerless. And now it was his turn. The whispers followed him as he walked toward the highway. And for the first time in his life, Brad Harris had nowhere to go. A life in ruins. The cold wind bit against Brad Harris' face as he walked down the cracked pavement of the empty highway. His feet ached, his body tense, but none of it compared to the storm raging inside him. His car was gone. His badge was gone. His gun, his uniform, his identity, all gone. The long stretch of road ahead of him felt symbolic, like some cruel joke from the universe. He had spent his entire career watching people walk away in defeat, arrested, handcuffed, humiliated, broken. Now, it was him. He was the one walking away. Except there were no handcuffs. No patrol car dragging him back to the station. Just the lonely, humiliating silence of a man who had lost everything. The world knows his name. His phone buzzed again. He knew what awaited him. He knew what the headlines would say. But he still looked. Officer TASES Secret Service Agent, Luzes CAREER, in CVE in Minutes. The fall of a disgracedcop, shaking FOTG from gas station inside Ent. Brad Harris, former officer, under federal investigation. His name was everywhere. There were thousands, no, millions, of comments under the video. Some called for his arrest. Others called for his entire life to be ruined. And the worst ones were the ones that said, "How many others has he done this to? I bet this isn't the first time. How many lives did he ruin before he got caught?" Brad's stomach churned. He felt physically sick. Because they were right. Maybe he hadn't tasted a Secret Service agent before, but he had pulled over black men who looked suspicious. He had made traffic stops last longer than necessary just to flex his authority. He had forced compliance from people who had done nothing wrong. and he had never thought twice about it. Until now. Now that he was on the receiving end, he realized something he had never admitted before. It had never been about the law. It had always been about control. And now he had none. Facing the Ifamala. His house looked different when he arrived. The lights were off. The front door was shut tight. The windows, usually open, were drawn with thick curtains, as if the entire house was hiding from him. Brad stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hesitating. His chest felt tight. His heart pounded loudly in his ears. For the first time in years, he was scared to go home. But he had nowhere else to go. With slow, hesitant steps, he walked up to the front door and knocked. Nothing. His wife, Lisa, didn't answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Brad clenched his jaw and knocked again, harder this time. "Lisa," he called. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Open the door." A shadow moved behind the curtain. He knew she was there. After a few agonizing moments, the lock clicked, and the door creaked open just an inch. Lisa's tired, red-rimmed eyes stared back at him. Brad's breath caught in his throat. She had been crying. "Lisa," his voice cracked. "Let me in." She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared. And for the first time, he realized. She had already seen the video. She had already seen his face plastered on the news. And she had already made up her mind. "You need to leave, Brad." His heart stopped. "What?" His voice barely came out. Lisa exhaled slowly, as if she had prepared for this moment. "I got a call from my brother," she said, her voice shaking. "He saw the video. My coworkers saw the video. The kids' teachers saw the video." She paused. "They asked me if I was safe, Brad." Brad winced. "Lisa, do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice rose now, her pain spilling out. "The entire country knows your name. Our kids' names. People are calling me. People are calling our neighbors. People are asking if I'm married to a racist cop." Brad's hands shook. He reached for the door. Lisa stepped back. "Lisa, please. She shook her head. "I can't do this, Brad." A deep, sinking feeling formed in his chest. "Where are the kids?" Lisa's lips trembled. "They're at my sister's." Brad felt like he had been punched in the gut. "You sent them away." Lisa's eyes hardened. "I'm protecting them," she said, her voice like ice. "Something you should have done instead of." She stopped herself. Instead of what? Instead of tasing a woman for no reason. Instead of losing his job in front of the whole country. Instead of destroying their family's life. She didn't have to say it. They both knew. "You need to go, Brad." Her voice was final. The door closed. And locked. Brad Harris stood there, staring at the wood grain of the door he had walked through 1,000 times before. And now it was closed to him forever. The final realization. He didn't know how long he stood there. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. But eventually, his feet moved. They carried him away from his own home. Away from his wife. Away from his kids. He had nowhere left to go. No career. No future. No power. And as he walked through the dimly lit streets, he realized something awful. For the first time in his life, for the first time since he had put on a badge, since he had stepped into a uniform, since he had looked in the mirror and seen a man with authority, Brad Harris finally knew what it felt like. To be powerless. The long road to nowhere. The cold wind howled against Brad Harris' face as he trudged down the dimly lit streets, his breath visible in the night air. He had walked for hours, but he had nowhere to go. Every step felt like a punishment. Every passing car felt like an accusation. Every shadow felt like the weight of his mistakes. His home was gone. His career destroyed. His reputation obliterated. And the worst part, he deserved it. Brad had spent his entire career believing in his authority. He thought the badge made him untouchable, that his actions would never be questioned, that his power would always protect him. But now he was just another disgraced name, another headline, another warning to every cop in America. This is what happens when the system turns on you. Brad's chest tightened, because that's exactly how it felt, like the world had turned against him. But then, in the depths of his own despair, a darker thought emerged. Maybe the world didn't turn against me. Maybe I was always the problem. The AFTERMAT. He needed somewhere to think, somewhere to breathe. He found himself at a 24-hour diner, its neon OPEN sign buzzing faintly in the quiet of the night. He walked in, his head low, his body aching from exhaustion. The place was mostly empty, except for a few late-night stragglers, truckers and travelers trying to shake off the night's fatigue. Brad shuffled to the counter and sat down, ignoring the way people looked at him. Because they recognized him. They knew who he was. The viral video had already reached everywhere. And Brad Harris. He was the villain of the story. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, walked over, staring at him cautiously. "You want coffee?" she asked, her voice neutral. Brad nodded. She poured the cup in silence. No small talk. No friendly smile. Just coldness, because he wasn't worth kindness anymore. He took a sip, the bitter liquid burning his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something foreign, something he had never felt in all the times he had pulled someone over, in all the times he had escalated a situation, in all the times he had asserted his control over others. Fear. Not fear for his career, not fear for his reputation, but fear of the truth. The first APOOG. As he sat there, staring into the swirling darkness of his coffee, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You don't look so tough now." Brad flinched. He turned his head slightly. A man sat a few seats down, a black man, probably in his 40s, a face lined with experience, eyes filled with something that wasn't anger, but wasn't sympathy either. Brad knew immediately. He was one of them. One of the men who had been on the other side of a badge like his. "Yeah," Brad muttered, staring at the counter. "Guess not." The man sipped his drink, never taking his eyes off Brad. "I know who you are," the man said finally. Brad exhaled sharply. "I figured." The man leaned back in his seat. "You ever wonder how many people you did this to?" Brad's stomach twisted. The man wasn't yelling. He wasn't cursing him out. He was just asking. Like he already knew the answer. Brad swallowed. His throat felt dry. "I don't know," he admitted. The words felt heavy. The man nodded slowly. "Yeah, you never do you?" Brad didn't answer. Because there was no answer. How many times had he ruined someone's day because of a routine stop? How many times had he made people afraid because he had the power to? How many times had he let his biases shape his decisions? The man didn't push, didn't demand anything. Just let the silence stretch. And for the first time in his life, Brad Harris felt something deep and painful in his chest. Regret. Not the kind of regret that comes from getting caught. The kind of regret that comes from finally seeing the damage you've done. He turned slightly, looking at the man, and for the first time since this all started, he said the words, "I'm sorry." The man exhaled, setting his cup down. He stared at Brad for a long moment, as if trying to decide if the apology was real. Then he nodded once. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "Good," the man said. "Now what are you going to do about it?" Brad blinked. He hesitated. "I don't know." The man shrugged. "Then you ain't sorry enough." Brad sat there, stunned. And for the first time, he understood. An apology wasn't enough. Feeling bad wasn't enough. Regret without change meant nothing. The first step toward something else. Brad left the diner an hour later, his mind swirling. The road stretched ahead of him, empty and dark. And he had a choice. He could spend the rest of his life being angry, being bitter, blaming everyone but himself. Or he could start facing the truth. 3 years later, the world had moved on. New scandals. New cops caught abusing power. Brad wasn't the biggest villain anymore, but he still had nowhere to go. No police force would hire him. No law enforcement career would take him back. And yet, he kept hearing the man's voice from that diner. Now what are you going to do about it? So one day, he did something he never thought he would. He walked into a community center in his old neighborhood, sat down, and listened. Not as a cop, not as an officer, not as someone who held power, but as a man who had lost it all. A man trying to understand. And maybe, just maybe, a man trying to change. Brad Harris was never going back to being a cop. He had lost that right. But maybe, if he spent enough time listening instead of talking, maybe if he learned instead of assumed, maybe if he finally saw people as human instead of threats, maybe one day he'd become something better than he had been. Maybe one day he'd be more than just the cop who lost everything. Maybe one day he'd finally be a man worth respecting. But that journey had just begun.